Hello, my name's Ben, and this is a series of GCSE Sociology videos to help you with your revision. Now, the idea of it is going to be that I'm going to go through about 10 different videos, and each of them is going to deal with a different part of the specification. So fundamentally, what we're doing to start off with, we're going to look at the introduction to sociology, some of the basics. We're then going to do a bunch of videos on family. Then we'll have a few on education, and we'll finish off with one on research methods. And the idea of it is that you use these videos to kind of supplement your understanding, use them to remind yourself of some of the key things that have been taught, and occasionally along the lines I will also bring up a couple of exam questions so you can see how you might apply some of this knowledge to an exam-based question. Now, without further ado, let's get into the first session. So hopefully I would have gone up into that corner up there, and you can now see what we're doing today. So introduction to the video series, which basically I've done. My name's Ben, I teach sociology. This is going to be a bunch of sociology videos for GCSE students, and then we're going to look at some norms, values, culture. So we're looking very much at the basics of the key concepts of sociology today: norms, values, culture, identity, role, status, socialization, primary and secondary, and also about social control and the use of sanctions. Now, one of the things I should say before I go through this is that I'm going to go pretty fast because I want these videos to be quite quick. But obviously what you can do is just pause the video and go back over what I might have said in case I go a little bit too quick for you. The other thing I should say really quickly is that I teach the EduCast GCSE Sociology course, but to be honest, if you do AQA or any other exam board, this will be useful stuff for you. The only time it won't be is when I look at exam questions, and I'll tell you this won't be for you if you do AQA. So without further ado, let's have a look at the rest of what we're doing today. So norms, values, and culture. Now, in sociology, these are like the building blocks of what you're going to need to know about. And norms are effectively the unwritten rules of society. They're expected things that we expect to see at various points throughout our society. So, for example, classic example might be when we have a dinner in the UK, you might be expected to eat with a knife and fork, whereas perhaps if you're in Japan or China, you might be eating your dinner with chopsticks. It's just normal expected behaviours in different social situations. Okay, so norms, they're a bit like laws or a bit like the unwritten rules of society, but they're not written down. Okay, so just expectations we have. Values, often students find this a little bit tricky because values aren't behaviors that we do. They're more about like ideas, beliefs, and important things that we think about. They're about like how we should live our lives. So things like respect, tolerance, freedom, equality might be some classic sort of traditional British values. Some people might even say that they have religious values. So if you're a Christian, you might have a particular set of Christian values. If you're a Muslim, you might subscribe to more Islamic values. Or also, if you are quite traditional in your views, you might say that you have traditional family values. Values are things that we think about. Norms are things that we do, right? And so if we put both of those two things together, we've got norms and values there. We're going to add those two things together to create culture, because what culture is, it's basically the collection of norms, values, other customs, traditions, and things that people do or think or how they behave in a shared way. So culture is basically a shared way of life of a society made up of norms and values. And there I've given a couple of examples that you might expect to see sort of things we associate with traditional British culture. So, for example, football kicking off at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, having a roast on a Sunday lunchtime, going to the pub and having a pint of beer, having fish and chips on a Friday. Those kind of things are like traditional aspects of British culture. Okay, so norms, values, and culture. Now we're going to have a look at identity, roles, and status, because identity is like, as a concept, we all know what it means, but sometimes it's quite difficult to articulate exactly what it does mean. So identity is basically the idea that you have about you and how other people see you. It's like your sense of self. It's what you're all about, how you see yourself and how other people see you. And what I've written there is CAGE, which basically stands for class, age, gender, and ethnicity. And those four things will be key contributors to your own overall sense of identity. Of course, there will be other things in it. So like what color hair you've got, what color clothes you wear, what music you like, what you like to eat, and all that kind of stuff. But in sociology, what we're kind of fundamentally thinking about is aspects relating to your class, age, gender, and ethnicity. And those things will give your identity a different feel to other people. It's all wrapped up with different norms and values. Now, a role is just a part or a job that you play in society, and there are people have completely different sets of roles. So, for instance, in my role right now, I'm acting as a YouTuber or like a tutor type thing. I'm also a teacher. I'm a brother. I'm a son. You know, I have all of these roles in society, and so do you. And you might be able to think about some of the roles that you play, perhaps like a student, and perhaps other things like that as well. Now, because we have multiple roles, often they can conflict with each other. So by this, what I mean is that your one role, let's say my role as a teacher, and also my role as someone who likes having an alcoholic drink occasionally, just occasionally, occasionally. If I have a student who happens to, and this has happened, if I see a student down the pub, one of my sixth formers, they might feel a little bit conflicted in how they kind of approach me or they deal with me, because I'm not wearing my suit and tie, I'm not standing in front of a class, I'm standing at the bar, well, not anymore, I'm sat at a table, getting nice table service, having an alcoholic drink. And it's unusual because you're not quite sure how to react to that person in that situation, because they're not playing the role that you often see. Other examples might be, I don't know, for instance, a working mum. So you've got the role of a mother looking after kids at home, but also having that role as an employee. Balancing those two roles can cause conflict for people. And the final thing I'm just going to mention is status. So status is basically like the level of importance that someone is seen to have, or their job is seen to have in society. It's how far up the pyramid you are according to what you do and who you are. And status, it's very subjective, but basically it's really kind of like depends on about like the type of job you've got, what roles you play in society. Are you responsible? Do you have a lot of responsibility? Are you someone entrusted with certain things? But when we talk about status, like the key distinction at GCSE is between what we call ascribed status, which is when you are born with a certain status. For instance, the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, was born into the royal family. So that's her status as a royal. She can't really do anything to change that, although Prince Harry and Meghan might disagree. And then also the more common type of status we have in the UK certainly is achieved status. So this is where you get to occupy a role, for instance, a teacher or head of sociology, through the basis of hard work, effort, and determination. So you've made that status for yourself. You haven't just been given it to you. Okay, so identity, roles, and status. Now, probably the biggest concept that you're going to come across in sociology is that of socialization. And socialization is basically the processes through which we learn the norms and values and culture of our society. So it might be given to us or taught to us through what we call agents of socialization. And what we mean by this is any group in society or an institution that can socialize us. So the classic example would be the family, but you've also got to think about as we get older, for instance, agents of socialization include things like the peer group, so your friends, the media, your religion if you've got one, your workplace if you go to work, and also education as well, amongst other things. Now, we split socialization into two things. We talk about primary socialization, which is basically only taught to you by your family when you're really young. So really like the age before you go to school. So sort of like between the ages of like 0 and 5. And during this time, you'll learn basic norms. So like language, learning to speak, learning values like sharing or responsibility or those kind of things. Okay, so the real basics in life. And when we get to talk about secondary socialization, we mean this has been any kind of socialization you get really from after the age of about 5. So this might be involving, as I mentioned earlier, going to school. So you'll learn different things at school than you will at home. The media, so what you watch on TV, YouTube, Netflix, what music you listen to, what films you go to watch, all of those things, newspapers you read, books you read, magazines you read, all of those things will affect who you are and how you become who you are for your identity. Your peers, so who you hang out with, your friends, whether they have a positive or perhaps negative influence on you. When you get older, of course, now you go to work and that will have an influence on you. So even thinking about the kind of clothes that you wear, how you speak, how you handle yourself. And also, as I mentioned earlier, if you have a religion, that will also have a big role in socializing you into certain norms and values and ways that you live your life. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of stuff there. Interestingly, with secondary socialization, I'll throw in a sociologist for you. Talcott Parsons, the functionalist, actually referred to education as like a bridge between the family and wider society, because what he was saying basically is in the family, you do get socialized, but your family are going to love you kind of unconditionally, like no matter what you do. And so my example I always give is like when you go to like nursery school, you'll remember you'd have made a picture either out of like pasta and like metallic gold paint. I don't know why we did that. Or perhaps let's think about that classic one of where you paint half a potato and you stick it on like bits of paper. You take it home, you show mum and dad, and they're like, oh my goodness, that's wonderful. Let's stick it on the fridge. And they're like, yeah, great, awesome. But it's not really that good. And so what Parsons is saying is that education basically treats us a little bit harsher and sort of socializes in a way that we aren't going to constantly be loved or done well, for instance. So for instance, you will have experiences of education where you've done a piece of work and it hasn't been particularly good and your teacher's told you as such. Your family might not do that. Okay, so that's what Parsons means when he talks about education being a bridge between the family and wider society. Now, I mentioned previously there about three kinds of agents of secondary socialization that can socialize us. And I've just got three here, so I'm going to pick them out and I'm going to give you some examples about how these agents can actually socialize us. So starting with the media, by which we mean TV, newspapers, magazines, books, radio, music, anything that that you consume, watch or listen to or read. We can think about the influence of role models in the media. Now, even if that might be a famous footballer or a pop star or anything like that, you can take on the influences of those people. For instance, liking what they do, or even if we look at the second one, they're imitating their behavior. So if you are particularly fond of, I don't know, a particular type of musician and they talk in a certain way, they dress in a certain way, or even they promote certain products, that's then you starting to copy what they do. So if you ever see, like, if you live in a rural area and you see a lot of people walking around all gangster and that idea has come from the media on the whole. Okay, and the last thing as well, we can think about the media in the way in which it represents certain groups. So the media give us information on things that we often don't have first-hand contact with. So let's think about an example of, like, let's say the people who are migrating to Britain on like small life rafts and little like dinghies and stuff at the moment. The way that group is represented and shown by the media will affect how you feel about them. And I'm not just talking about that group, it could be any group in society. So thinking along those lines of class, age, gender, ethnicity, the media can have a big effect on how you feel about particular types of people. When it comes to education, so we've got there different types of curriculum. So the formal curriculum is basically the lessons you get taught in school. So everything you learn through that's constantly socializing you, because you're learning new stuff. You're seeing new ways of figuring out the world. The hidden curriculum is anything that we learn in schools that isn't in formal lessons. So it might be things like obedience, so listening to your teachers. It might be punctuality, turning up on time. It might be the thing about competition. So why do we have sports days in school? Yeah, it's nice to have a day off and sit on, go around the field or whatever, but it's also to encourage that idea of competition and that there will be winners and losers in life. So that is a way of teaching us things. And the last thing as well is we've got this use of sanctions. Now, sanctions can be positive or negative. When we think of a positive sanction, we think of a reward. So perhaps you might get, I don't know what they give at your school, but like at my school, they give these things called golden tickets, which means that if you've done well, you get a golden ticket, and at the end of the term, your ticket goes into like a tombola raffle type thing. And if you get picked out, you might win something. The other type of sanction is a punishment. So let's do the classic example of, if you've not behaved yourself at school, what's going to happen? You're going to get a detention. And these things teach you that your actions have consequences, either positive or negative. And then when we come to look at the peer group as well, you'll notice some of these things I've mentioned already. That's just applying it in a different way. So again, there might be people in your peer group, in your group, who are role models to you. You kind of almost copy what they do. You want to be like them. You certainly want them to like you. We can think about the role of peer pressure, which can be positive or negative. So for instance, negatively encouraging you to smoke or take drugs, positively encouraging you to do your homework or revise for a test. And also there we've got the use of sanctions. So in education, we talked about the use of punishments and rewards. In peer groups, it's the same as well, but let's think about more kind of informal sanctions that might be given. So for instance, if you have a falling out with a group of friends, your peer group might well shun you and ostracize you, or like block you from a WhatsApp group or something like that. That's a way in which the peer group can show us that your behavior has not been acceptable to them for whatever reason. Okay. And then we're going to sort of have a little look at gender role socialization, because this is really important. It crops up on the EduCAS exam quite a lot, particularly in that first section. And basically what we're talking about with this is the ways in which boys and girls are kind of socialized to adhere to certain stereotypical gender roles in society. So what is a gender role, firstly? Well, gender roles are like characteristics and behaviors that we associate with boys and girls in society. So the classic example might be that boys are strong and that girls should be caring, that kind of thing. Absolute load of rubbish, but it's stereotypical. And the way in which we are socialized often puts us into these what we might call binary gender categories. So if you're a boy, you'll be brought up in a certain way. If you're a girl, you'll be brought up in a certain way. So let's look at some examples of this. Anne Oakley, a feminist sociology, argued that in the family, we have this process called canalization, which is giving young boys and young girls certain toys or clothes. So you might give a boy an Action Man, a girl a Barbie. You might dress boys in blue, girls in pink, for instance. And this is what she calls canalization. You are literally kind of channeling these kids to do certain things. Wear this, play with this. The other thing she's talked about is like manipulation, which is basically like encouragement of different children to behave in certain ways, or you're going to treat them in slightly different ways. So canalization is like you're doing it. Manipulation is a bit more kind of light touch encouragement. When we think about in schools, there's loads of ways, and I'm going to talk about this in a lesson on schools and education later on down the line. But when we think about how you're gender socialized in school, either through things like gendered subjects, so there are certain subjects in schools that are considered to be either more female or more male. You might give the example of things like technology with like home economics, when we're talking about food tech, or textiles being a traditionally female subject, with things like resistant materials and engineering being traditionally boys subjects. We can also think about the representation of girls and boys in different textbooks. This is slightly outdated now, but certainly when I was at school in the 90s, there were images of, you open up a science textbook, the guy in the white coat, the scientist, would be a man. If you open up a technology textbook, the person staying at home to prepare food would be a woman, that kind of thing. The other thing we've got to think about is the role of the hidden curriculum. So anything we learn that isn't in lessons, it might be teacher expectations. So for instance, if a teacher needs a table moved or something, they might ask for 2 strong boys. Have I got 2 strong boys? Rather than just 2 strong people, like, come on. And also through the media. So the way in which we might represent gender in films, for instance. How many films can you think of where the lead role, or in like an action movie, is a man? How many can you think of when the lead role in an action movie is a woman? It's not that many. That's why we have films, for instance, like Wonder Woman doing really well, and Captain Marvel as well, doing really well at the box office, because they show slightly different gender roles in the lead role. So just some examples there of gender role socialization for you. And the final thing I'm going to talk about today is social control and sanctions. So basically, social control is making sure that you do what you're supposed to if you don't stick to the norms and values and the culture of society. So we're going to break this down into 2 groups. We're going to call one formal social control, which is any group whose job it is to control behavior. So thinking about things like the police, prison system, courts, even the army, their job is to control behavior. They often go around with guns or abilities to literally physically restrain people if they need to. And then informal social control is just any other agent. So it might be your family, education, peers, and they can treat you in slightly different ways. But their main job, despite what you might think about your mum and your teachers, ain't to control you. It's something different. Now, when it comes to sanctions, we're talking here about different agents of social control are basically going to encourage you to behave through use of sanctions. So this might basically be either what we call, as I mentioned earlier, negative sanctions, which are punishments, or positive sanctions, which are threats. So do this and we'll reward you like this, or if you don't do this, we'll punish you like this. That's basically the idea. So when we think about what we call formal sanctions, so going back to those formal agents of social control like the police, the army, the courts, the prison system, these are actions and sanctions that they can give that are like quite serious. So things like arrest, being put under a prison sentence, being given a fine, those kind of things. They're formal because they've been given by the formal agents of social control. Informally, we can think about any other of those informal agents of social control giving us a sanction. So it might be being grounded by your parents, getting a detention at school. It might be getting a warning from work. Anything like that would be an informal sanction because it hasn't got that kind of punchy like power that the police would have if they arrested you, or if you got given a fine or a prison sentence from the courts, those kind of things. So that's it really for the first session today, first video lesson. Just to recap what we've gone through, I told you a little bit about why I'm doing this and what you can expect to see. We went through the key ideas of norms and values and culture, some of the building blocks of sociology. We then started to look at the ways in which sociology might affect the individual by looking at what we mean by identity, what different roles we can play, how those roles can interact, and also how our status is seen in society, either as ascribed, i.e. born with, or achieved, i.e. created through yourself. Then we started to look at socialization, so cutting socialization between primary and secondary socialization, looking at different agents of secondary socialization and how they might have an impact on us by focusing on the role of the media, education and peers. And then finally, we finished off there by looking at some social control issues, looking at informal and formal social control and some sanctions. So that's me. I'm back again. That was it. How long have I been banging on for? Nearly 20 minutes, but that's not too bad. The next video is going to start off on looking at the role of the family in society and different family types. So hopefully after you check this one out, go and have a look at that one, and I hope you enjoy it. If you've liked this video, do me a massive favor. Put a like on it, subscribe to us, go and visit us on Instagram at instagram.com/allsociology. Go and have a listen to the podcast, which you can find at by searching for All Sociology, all one word, on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. And that's it for me from now. So I've been Ben. Hope you've enjoyed it. I'll see you again very soon. Bye.